Hey, thanks so much, Deb. And thank you, everyone, for your flexibility in having me online today. Unfortunately, with the weather, I'm going to be doing it from home. So it really feels like deja vu with the pandemic days of doing this online. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully, everyone can hear me okay. Let me know if that changes and I can adjust. But yeah, I'm very excited to talk with you and share with you my recent trip to Massachusetts, which, as some of you may know, is the town most closely associated with Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women, as well as many other notable figures and a lot more of American history too. So we'll talk about that a little bit. A little bit of background about me. I work for the Bridges Library System, which is connected to all of the public libraries in Jefferson and Waukesha counties. But on the side, I am kind of an amateur historian, scholar of Louisa May Alcott. I have a podcast about Louisa May Alcott. I'm a member of the Louisa May Alcott Society, and I give presentations about Alcott to libraries, museums. I'm actually going to be going out to Concord again in July to present at the Henry David Thoreau Conference about health and wellness in Louisa May Alcott's work. So I do that on the side when I have a spare minute. I'm a big fan of Alcott, not just her work, but her biography as well. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about her and who she was. And while I do that, I'll be doing that through the places that we visited when we were out there. Even though I have studied Louisa May Alcott for about 11, 12 years now, this was actually July of 2022 was my first time actually going out to Massachusetts. I had never been out there before, and I had never seen a lot of the sites that are associated with her and her life. So this was a really important trip for me. I took my family along with me, my husband and my son, and we actually went and stayed with my friend, who my friend Jamie is part of the podcast with me. She's my co-host and kind of my co-creator. So it was great. We got to do a lot of family time and friend time, as well as a lot of Alcott time. So I'm going to just give you a little background about Alcott, and then we'll start looking at some of the places that we visited and talking a little bit about some history and some biography. And so if you love all of those things, then strap right on in, because that's what we're going to be talking about. So many of you might associate Louisa May Alcott with the big book, right? Little Women. This is the book that everyone knows, or maybe the movies. Maybe you haven't read the book, but you know the movies, right? We've got some of her, I've put up some clips here from some of the most well-known adaptations of the movie. So Little Women was her big blockbuster book, not her first novel that was ever published, but this was written in 1868. The first part it was written after the Civil War, and this is really what made Louisa May Alcott famous. This was not her only novel, though. After Little Women, she wrote many, many more novels. She had written many, many novels and books and stories before Little Women. And she ended up becoming one of the most famous and richest women novelists of her time. So she is still really well known for Little Women, but at the time that she was alive, she was actually known for a lot more, not just Little Women. Old-Fashioned Girl was one of her most popular books at the time, and as was Jack and Jill and a couple other ones. So we still remember her for Little Women, but she has a lot more in her genre, in her all of her different books. So here's the Alcott family. So there's Anna, which is her oldest sister. There's Louisa there. Elizabeth, which is her younger sister, and then May, which is her youngest sister. So there are 4 sisters, just like in Little Women. And I'm not going to go into all of that history. I could talk about the Alcotts for hours, but we're really here to, go through my trip. But I'm just giving you a little bit of a backstory. But she did model all of the characters in Little Women on herself and her sisters. So it is a little bit autobiographical. And so these are the actual photographs of her and her sisters. So this is Anna is Meg in the book. Elizabeth is Beth. You can see she took Beth from Elizabeth. And then May, she just kind of changed the letters around and made the character of Amy. So she took M-A-Y and made A-M-Y. She made Amy. And so Louisa is, of course, Jo, the writer. And then there are her parents, Abigail, known as Abba. That was her mother. She was very close to her mother, and they had a very loving relationship. And she's Marmee in the book. And there's Bronson, her father. And he was a transcendentalist. He was very close with Emerson and Thoreau. And they had a little bit more of a contentious relationship. They loved each other. They doted on each other. Louisa took care of him in his old age. But he had just different perspectives of the world than Louisa did, is kind of how I would put it. And as you can tell in Little Women, at least the first part, the father is pretty non-existent. He's not really in the book. And scholars have talked about kind of why that is and what that says about Louisa and her relationship with her father. All right, so let's talk about Concord, Massachusetts. Now, every photo, except for the historic photos of the Alcotts, every photo in here is mine of photos I took when I was on my trip, except for this top one. And as I put in here, that's from the Community Preservation Coalition. So it's a little blurry. And that's because it is a town hall in Concord, and I forgot to take a photo of it, and I'm very bummed at myself. So I'm going to have to take it when I go back this summer. But many people may know of Concord, Massachusetts, not just because of Louisa May Alcott, but because it plays a pretty pivotal role in American history. It was where the first battle of the Revolutionary War was fought on April 19th, 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. There was a little skirmish in the town of Lexington, which is right next door, and then there was a battle in Concord. There was some colonial regulars who fought the British, about 400, I think, 400 or 100 regulars militiamen engaged some regulars, and there was some fighting there near the Old North Bridge. So you can see there's the statue there that I took a picture of, and that is there at the Old North Bridge, and you can walk through Minuteman Park. And you can really look and kind of learn more about the Revolutionary War history. So Concord is just full of just history everywhere you go. Town Hall, this building here, is notable for lots of different reasons, and it's been standing there for centuries. The reason that I really love it is because it's the location where the first election where women were allowed to vote in Concord took place, and that happened in 1880. So long before women's suffrage happened, but the women were only allowed to vote for school board members. That was what they were allowed to vote for. And Louisa May Alcott was the first woman to register to vote for that election. She fiercely believed in women's suffrage, and she held women's suffrage meetings at her home, trying to rally the women of Concord to, be brave and go and vote. Your house isn't going to burn down if you, step in there and vote. And so she actually kind of led the women to do this voting, and she was one of the ones that went to town hall and did her voting there. And as you can see, there's another photo I took of downtown Concord. Concord, of course, has really great bookstores, and as a book lover, we made sure to stop in. There's the Concord Bookshop, there's Barrow Bookstore, so if you're ever in Concord, make sure that you hit up some of the bookstores too. All right, so I'm going to start first with, now the Alcotts lived in Concord throughout most of Louisa's lifetime, but they moved in and out. They did not just get a house and that's where they stayed. This is Orchard House is the one that's most well known of Louisa's, the Alcott's homes, because it's in almost all of the movies. If you recognize this house, it's probably because you've seen one of the movies. And it's because most of the movies have taken this house and they have modeled the locations after this house. And so this is the actual Orchard House Museum. Now, the Alcotts first moved to Concord in the 1840s when Louisa was small, when she was little. And they moved in and out of different homes throughout Concord. And this is because Bronson Alcott, Louisa's father, was friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived in Concord. And Emerson had this idea. He was a literary figure. He was a writer. He was a transcendentalist. He wanted to kind of create his own little circle. And so he thought, well, I'm just going to move all of my smart writer friends to Concord and just kind of create my own little Boston. And so that's kind of what he did. He encouraged a lot of people to come. He had an old family ancestral home called the Old Manse that he allowed Nathaniel Hawthorne to live in after Nathaniel Hawthorne got married. He had his friend Margaret Fuller come a lot. Elizabeth Peabody he encouraged to come. So a lot of like his intellectual friends, he encouraged them to come and stay in Concord. His idea was to create this kind of just this like mini Boston where all of these intelligent people were, commingling and having their great discussions. And it kind of worked. A lot of them did stay in Concord, and that's kind of how Concord is remembered today for a lot of people. So that's why the Alcotts came. But they moved in and out. They went back and forth to Boston because they were actually really poor. Bronson was not very good at making money. And so they tended to kind of just scrape by. And so often they had to maybe sell a home or, go rent something else, or they'd have to go back to Boston so that the girls and the mother could work. And so they were just back and forth a lot. And it wasn't until they bought this in, I believe, I think I'm going to have it in the next slide. Let me see. I have it. Yeah, 1857 is when they bought this house, and they lived here for 20 years. So this is one of the homes where they lived the longest. And that's kind of why it's mostly associated with Louisa and with the Alcott family. So they lived here until 1877. This is where Louisa wrote Little Women. And as you can see, so I did find this historic photo. This is the only photo of the Alcott family in front of Orchard House. And Louisa is sitting down on the ground right here. It's kind of hard to see, but she's sitting there kind of like this, and she's like turned to the side. So I think this is her sister Anna who's sitting behind her. So she's kind of blocking her out a little bit. But that's the house as it is today, or as it was shortly after they bought it. And as you can see, it's got, bigger trees, and there's an apple orchard here. There was an apple orchard when they bought it, which is why Bronson called it Orchard House. And what it was is it was originally a farmhouse and then another little house, and Bronson stuck the two together. He kind of moved them together and put them into one big house. And this house, the original farmhouse, had actually been there since the 1660s, and it's right on Lexington Road. So when the Battle of Lexington and Concord happened and all of those militiamen and stuff went by towards the Old North Bridge, they passed this house, the original farmhouse of this house. So this house has actually seen a lot of history. It's seen the first battle, people going to the first battle of the Revolution. It's the place where Little Women was written, and there's more history that's happened. If anyone has read the book Five Little Peppers and How They Grew, which was, I'm not 100% sure when that was written, maybe 1930s or so. The author of that is actually the one who bought this house later on and saved it and preserved it as a museum, and wanted to save it because it was Louisa May Alcott's house. So a lot of history in this home. As you can see, they have some beautiful grounds. You can see my family is there, my husband and my son. It was all decorated because we were there in July, so it was decorated for the 4th of July. You can't take pictures inside the home, which is why I don't have any interior shots. But when you go and visit, there are guides that will take you through. You get a very nice guided tour, and you are taken right into the front door. You're walked right into the parlor, and it looks very similar to, you feel like you're in a movie set. I really thought that I didn't feel like I was there. I felt like I was ready for cameras or something because I have watched the movie so many times. So that's the one thing where if you have seen any movies, especially maybe the 1994 version with Winona Ryder, or the new 2019 version with Saoirse Ronan and Emma Watson, it's very similar on the interior, especially like the parlor and the dining room area. You just feel like you're in a movie. It's very, very odd, but very wonderful. It's so cool because you can't believe that you're there. But one thing that's really neat about this home is that because there weren't many people that lived here afterwards, it actually was bought by someone in 1877 when Louisa sold it, but they never moved in. 80% of the furnishings inside this home is original to the Alcott family. So there are so many things inside. They have it set up almost exactly as it would have been. They have a lot of photos that they have based it on, and they actually do have, at the time when it was turned into a house museum, this was when it was being saved. It happened very soon after Louisa's death, within a couple of decades. So Louisa's nephews were still alive, or at least one of them was. So they were able to go in and kind of comment on, they remembered the home, or at least could comment on the family. And so there are things that a lot of it is preserved, which is wonderful. So you can go in and you can see Beth's or Lizzie's piano. You can see where they played games. You can see Louisa's, Anna's wedding dress is laid out on Louisa's bed. You can see just all sorts of things. Another really cool thing is that May, her sister, youngest sister, was an artist, just like Amy in the book and in the movies. And she was encouraged to draw wherever she wanted. And wherever she wanted ended up being on the walls of her bedroom. And she was a fabulous artist. She actually ended up going to Paris. She ended up having a painting in the Paris Salon. She was very talented. And so those drawings are beautiful, and they are all over her walls. It's gorgeous to go see them, and they've been preserved, and they have, plastic in front of them and stuff to preserve them. So that's really neat to see. So you walk on through with a guided tour guide, and they explain everything, and they tell you the story of the Alcotts and point out different things in all of the rooms. And so it's really a great experience. And the other building on the site is the Concord School of Philosophy, and that was a building. Bronson was a transcendentalist. He was a philosopher. He loved to give talks and presentations, although they didn't always make money for him, unfortunately. But later in life, he was able to kind of set up a school where people came and listened to him talk, and he would have Emerson talk and Elizabeth Peabody and other people, and people would flock. Part of the reason was because he was the father of Little Women, and this was Louisa May Alcott's house. But that's okay. He didn't mind. So he actually built a separate building. And so the Concord School of Philosophy is actually where the tours start. You go in there and then you watch a little video and the tours start. All right, I'm going to move it right along. So we are now going to backtrack. So that was Orchard House. That was a period of Louisa's life. She was in her 20s when they moved there. Lizzie had actually just died. So just like in Little Women, Lizzie did die when they were in their 20s. And then lived there into her 40s. That's where she wrote Little Women. That's where she left. She actually served as a nurse in the Civil War. She left from that home to do that. So she lived the bulk of her adult years in that home. But now we're going to back up a little bit. One of the places we went to is called Fruitlands. And this is where Louisa lived a very tumultuous year of her life when she was about 10 to 11. And this is actually located right outside of Concord in the town of Harvard, Massachusetts. And this was, Bronson, her father, was a bit of a dreamer. And he actually had this idea. Utopian societies were really big back then. So we're talking like the Shakers and all these, utopian ideals. Brook Farm was big. This idea that if you just take yourself out of society and set up this perfect society, then you're going to achieve perfection and you're going to, be better than everyone else and all of this stuff. So Bronson had this idea that he was going to set up his own perfect society. And so he purchased this piece of property, large piece of property, a farm really, with this farmhouse on it that was more dilapidated than it looks now, and had some followers that decided to come with him and brought his family, including Louisa, who was about 10 at the time. Anna was 12. Lizzie, I believe, was about 8. And then May was about 4. And set up this new farm, even though there wasn't much farming experience and they hadn't really done a whole lot. Oh, my cat's coming in, so my door's opening. That's all right. And so they set this experiment, but they were a little too late to get all the planting in, and they spent a lot of time going around trying to get followers instead of actually doing work on the farm, leaving the women and the girls there. And so it failed spectacularly, to put it lightly. This is a really interesting period of the Alcott's history and of Louisa's life. This is when her first journals are recorded and saved from. And she talks a lot about just some bright days, but also she had some really heavy periods, had some heavy times where she was just really anxious, really sad. She writes in her journals about just crying herself to sleep a lot and just really being just very upset. And her mother and father almost separated at this time as well, just because of just the stress and the tumultuousness of this period. So it was a very difficult time. They were living in this home with a lot of other people who were not their family. And it was just a very difficult time for the family. So, but coming to this farmhouse was really, really great on my trip. Jamie and I actually were able to give a talk as part of our tour, as part of the trip. And then right now, the farmhouse is actually part of an art museum campus. It was saved by Clara Endicott Sears, and she bought other buildings and moved them to the site. And now there's multiple buildings that if you go in, they are art galleries. And so they have so many programs throughout the year. They do hiking things. I think I just looked on their website. They're doing like hiking tours, all sorts of things. So it is a really robust, vibrant like museum now, which is wonderful. So it's not just you get to tour Fruitlands and see where the Alcotts lived, but then also there's these also incredible programs that they do around art, around nature. They also have this amazing, I think I have it in the next picture. Yep, here we go. You can see my son on the right. He is watching a concert. They have concerts out on this grassy meadow. They have a bandstand, and then once a week during the summer, they have bands and orchestras come and perform these amazing concerts when the sun is setting, and everyone brings picnics, and that's what we did, and it was beautiful. So it was just kind of this amazing, incredible experience where this is a place where Louisa kind of really had a difficult time of her life, and just seeing how it's kind of been transformed into this beautiful place where people can enjoy art and music and nature. So that was a really neat experience. On the left, you'll see this is the inside of the kitchen at the Fruitlands farmhouse. So this is where Abigail and the girls cooked for sometimes up to about 15 to 20 people at a time, depending on who was staying at the commune, and really just trying to just make ends meet. And then in the middle, you can see this is actually May, Louisa's youngest sister. This is her paint box. So again, I mentioned she was an artist, and so this was her paint box, and this is saved and on display at the Fruitlands farmhouse as well. So it's really lovely treat to see this. All right. So after the Fruitlands time, they moved into a home in Concord. This is in Concord again, actually right down the street from Orchard House Museum. And this is called Hillside. Well, it was called Hillside. If you look it up, it's now called the Wayside, which is a little confusing, but it's now called Hillside, or it's now called the Wayside. It was called Hillside. So they moved in here in 1845 when Louisa was about 12 and lived here until she was about 15 or so, until 1848. And this was a great time for Louisa. So during in Little Women, the period of Little Women, this was that even though it takes place at an orchard house in the Little Women book, that time of that age that Jo is and all of the escapades that they do, all of those things really took place in this home, in this time period when Louisa was this age. She really loved being in this home. The family was back together. They had left Fruitlands. It had failed. It did not work out. They were now in a different home, and they were together as a family. So this was kind of one of her favorite periods of her life, where she was safe and protected and with her family again. And at a time of her life where she was, kind of in the prime, where she was creative, and she was kind of, becoming an adolescent. And so that's kind of really reflected in Little Women, and that all played out here at Hillside. She says in her journal that I have at last got the little room I have wanted so long. So this is the first time she gets her own room. It was a room that opened out. There was a little door in the back that she could go run out into the woods. And Louisa was a runner. She loved to run. She loved to jog. She was very athletic and active. So this was something that she loved to do. So she loved Hillside, the home. The family were ardent abolitionists, the Alcott family. So we know of at least one documented instance of them harboring freedom seekers here in this house, enslaved people who had left slavery and were traveling north. So that is documented in Louisa's recollections. And Bronson makes note of it too. So we know of at least one person, and there were undoubtedly more, but they, obviously did not really record this very often because of it was, against the law because of Fugitive Slave Act and things like that. Well, Fugitive Slave Act may not have been in, I don't think that was in place yet, but still not something that people were really talking about. This was still a secretive. So so they were harboring freedom seekers in this home. Hillside also later became the home of Nathaniel Hawthorne. They moved out in 1848 and went back to Boston because they needed to make money and they needed to be back in the city where it was a little bit cheaper to live and they could rent something. So Nathaniel Hawthorne ended up moving in here and lived here quite a while until he became an ambassador to England and moved to England. And he was the one who renamed it the Wayside. And so that is what it's known as today. And it's also owned now by the National Park Service. If you wanted to visit, it's open select hours only. I wasn't able to visit when I was out in Concord. It wasn't open, but I did drive by and I took this picture. So it was kind of neat to at least see it. It's expanded a lot since Louisa's time, since the Alcotts lived there. Nathaniel Hawthorne and his family did add to it. I think that they, added some chimneys and some wings to it. And, so it kind of grew over time. And so it looks a little bit different than when the Alcotts lived there. But it's still pretty neat to see it. And it is really just right down the road from Orchard House. So they really became neighbors to the Hawthorns later when they moved back to Concord and moved into Orchard House. Just about 10 years later, the Hawthorns were living here. So they were Hawthorns' neighbors. So yeah, but they had lived in this house first. So then they lived in Orchard House for a while, and then now we'll skip ahead kind of in their timeline of where they lived in Concord. They lived in Louisa in 1877. She had published Little Women. She published more books by then. She was one of the richest female novelists in the country. And so she has lots more money than the Alcotts had ever had. I mean, they were really dirt poor until she really hit it big with her novels. And so now she has the funds to really support her family. She never married and never had children, so she really spent her money and her time and energy on supporting her parents and her sister, Anna, and her sister Anna's sons after Anna's husband died. So one of the things that she did in 1877, right before her mother died, is she rented out Orchard House to someone else because it was kind of drafty and kind of old, and she wanted a bit of a newer house or bigger house because the family was growing. So decided to purchase the Thoreau Alcott house. And it wasn't called that at the time, but that's what people call it now. And so it was previously owned by the Thoreau family. This was where Henry David Thoreau lived and died, actually. And they were good friends with the Thoreau family. And so she moved her whole family in here. This is where her mother, Abigail, ended up dying. And this is where Louisa lived off and on until her death in 1886, I believe. Or 1888, I'm sorry. Louisa often went to Boston to write because she liked to have the quiet. She liked to kind of be on her own. So she took care of her family, but then also, needed to kind of have her own space in order to write. But she did spend a lot of time in this home. This is where she wrote some of Jo's Boys, which is one of the last sequels to Little Women. This is where she held those suffrage meetings and started a temperance society in Concord. This is also where, when her youngest sister, May, died, May actually bequeathed her daughter, Lulu, to Louisa. And so when Lulu came, Louisa brought Lulu home to this house. It's located on Main Street in Concord. So if you're in Concord and you're kind of driving down Main Street past the library, it's right there. It was actually really close to the downtown, closer than I thought it was going to be. I thought it would be a little farther out of town like Orchard House is. But it's right there, and it's a beautiful house. And as you can see, I had to park on the side of the road and take a picture, just like I did with Hillside. And that's because it is still privately owned. A family lives there, so you can't go inside. And so I just took a picture from the outside. But it is a beautiful one. And it was really great to be able to see where Louisa had lived, kind of her last real home in Concord. Another place that I made sure that I wanted to visit when I was in Concord is the Concord Free Public Library. As you can see, there's Louisa, her bust, her statue there in the library. The library itself is beautiful. If anyone is library fans, and I bet you all are, definitely worth stopping in if you are ever in Concord. I love stopping into libraries anyway when I'm on my travels. But this one I had a special reason to visit. Because in the basement of the library is the William Monroe Special Collections. And in the special collections, you can view documents from the Alcotts. And there are quite a few places that have records from the Alcotts. Houghton Library at Harvard is one of the biggest. But I wasn't going to be able to make it to Cambridge on my trip. I was mostly centered around Concord. So this was going to be one of the only times I was going to be able to maybe see some documents that were actually written in Louisa's hand, in her handwriting, and be able to kind of take a look at those. So I wanted to make sure to stop in. The library is really close to the downtown. It's a beautiful building. And so it was easy to walk to. That's the one thing that I really liked about downtown Concord. It's one of those old New England towns that has the, it's just easy to navigate and easy to walk around once you park. And so we got some lunch, got some coffee, and then walked to the library. The really nice thing about the library and the special collections is that I kind of had a feeling that I'd have to make some sort of reservation. And we had decided we just had a couple extra hours in our day that we weren't anticipating. So I thought I wouldn't be able to go because I hadn't made an appointment. But I checked the website, and you don't have to make an appointment to go to the special collections. It's open whenever the library is open. So I really lucked out, and I was really excited. So as long as you have regular library hours, you can go down to the special collections. So when you go down there are, I told them I was looking for Alcott stuff. So the librarian pulled out Alcott stuff for me. And that includes original copies of 2 chapters of Little Women. Not all of the chapters of Little Women survive the original manuscripts of them, but they do have 2 chapters of them. And that was really neat to see. It's in, Louisa's handwriting. And there are things that are crossed out. You can see what she changed, words that she changed, things that she decided not to go with. And on the back of one of them, she does have written that she saved the chapters by mother's desire. Her mother wanted her to save those chapters. So she did make a note of that on the back. Her mother, Abigail, was very proud of her and really encouraged her writing. So that doesn't surprise me in the slightest. There's also, you can see the bottom picture is me holding one of the drawings, and these are original drafts of the illustrations by Frank Merrill. He was an illustrator who they put out new edition of Little Women in 1880. So it was originally published, first part in 1868 and the second part in 1869. And May, her sister, is actually the one who did the drawings for those. But in 1880, they did another edition, and Frank Merrill is the one who did the illustrations for those. And so Louisa got to see those drafts and go through them and make comments on the back. And so you can flip up over those illustrations and see her comments on the back. And so that was pretty neat too. So she'll make a note about, I don't really like this, or, Joe looks too old here, or, can you change this? So that was really cool to see that too. And they do have a few other things, like Bronson's copy of a book that May did called Concord Sketches, which are illustrations of different places in Concord. So that was really neat to be able to sit there and kind of page through all of those. They're all nicely archivally preserved and kept. So, you can just kind of go through and take a look. And they do allow photographs and copies. And so that was really neat too. So I was able to do that. And then there was lots of other places we went to that didn't necessarily have to do with Louisa, but places that Louisa was. So one of them is that I couldn't include in my presentation because I didn't want to go on and on all night long. One of them was Walden Pond, which is where Thoreau went and built his cabin for several years and wrote his famous piece called Walden. And Thoreau was a great friend of Louisa and the Alcotts, and taught Louisa a lot about nature. He was a little older than her, so he would take them through the woods. And so, Louisa would go swimming at Walden with her sisters. And so it was really cool to be there. And there were just places around Concord that we went. We drove past Emerson's house and, all these other different places like the Old Manse and things like that weren't necessarily connected to Louisa per se, but were still part of Concord's history and places that Louisa would have seen and were connected to people that Louisa would have known. And that was part of the really neat part about going to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery too. Louisa is buried there, so that was part of it. But there's also a lot of other people that are connected to Louisa or the Alcotts or Concord history. So it was neat to be part of that and to be there. I really love visiting cemeteries anyway, no matter where I'm at. That's another place. I visit libraries and I visit cemeteries. Both of them are full of stories, just in different forms. So that's why I like to go to both of them. But then, Sleepy Hollow Cemetery is kind of one of those special places. It was dedicated in 1855, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, was actually one of those people who kind of was in charge of getting the cemetery started and designed. He was kind of designing it based on transcendental views and beliefs about landscape and about, the individual kind of coming closer to spiritual transcendence. And so a lot of those ideas were part of his idea for a new cemetery that was kind of part of that, integrated into the landscape instead of being separate. And it's not connected to any church or any particular religious denomination, which was also kind of in line with transcendentalism too. So he was part of the movement to create this cemetery, and he's also buried there. He was buried there a few decades later then. He has a huge slab, but it's not a really fancy granite, obelisk or anything like that. It looks literally like just a giant boulder, just with his name carved on it. So it looks very natural, very much a part of the landscape, which I think kind of really does fit for Emerson. Louisa is buried there. You can see her gravestone there on the right. I took that picture. Someone had laid flowers there. Many people put pens and other things because she's a writer. So we laid a pen there. There were no other pens. Usually I've seen pictures of her tombstone and there's usually tons and tons of pens, but someone must have just cleaned them up. So we put a pen there and ours was the first one. But there were like lots of little rocks, as you can see. She also does have, as I mentioned really briefly, she does have a veterans insignia there. And she did, because it was the 4th of July, they had placed flags by veteran stones. So she does have one. And that is because during the Civil War, she went to Washington, D.C. and served as a nurse in the Army hospital. And she actually got very sick and almost died of typhoid fever. So it's really interesting because in the book Little Women, the father is at war and the girls and the mother are at home on the home front. But in real life, Louisa was the one who went to war. And she, experienced a lot of things and saw a lot of things at that Army hospital. That her first book that really became a success was called Hospital Sketches. It's a very short little book, but it's about kind of her experience as a nurse in the hospital. And it was published during the Civil War. So it was kind of one of those first books that people were reading while the war was still going on, where they were kind of war literature while it was still happening. And it was a bestseller, and it really kind of started making her name and really led to Little Women. So very interesting kind of how that came about. And she recovered, although she was always sick for the rest of her life. She never fully recovered. Her physical body was always, they never quite knew why, but she was always sick after that typhoid fever. But that is why she has the insignia there or the plaque, and that's why she has her flag. So she's buried there. She died in 1888 in her 50s, so quite young, but again, she had struggled with her health for many decades. And her whole family is buried there too. Her mother, her father, her sister Lizzie, and then her sister Anna is buried nearby with Anna's husband, John, and then Anna's sons are buried close by as well. Her sister May died over in Paris, actually. She was living there. She was an artist, and she was married to a man named Ernst Nieriker, and she had a daughter and died shortly after having her. So she's buried over in Paris, but there's a stone for her here in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Other notable burials that I was able to find and see in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, Henry David Thoreau is there. You can see there's a stone. It's called Author's Ridge, actually, because there's all of these writers are lined up along this one stretch. And so Ralph Waldo Emerson's there, the Alcotts, Henry David Thoreau, Elizabeth Peabody. I don't know if she's there, but Nathaniel Hawthorne is on Author's Ridge. And so he's, the author of Scarlet Letter and House of the Seven Gables. But other people that are buried in Sleepy Hollow, not on Author's Ridge, but throughout the cemetery, include Elizabeth Peabody, who was the first person to found the first kindergarten in America. And she was one of the transcendentalists too. Catherine Kennicott Davis. That name may not sound familiar, but I bet you know one of the songs that she composed, and it's Little Drummer Boy. So she's buried there. And then Daniel Chester French, and he is a sculptor who sculpted the Lincoln Memorial. He was actually one of the May Alcott, so Louisa's youngest sister, was one of her students. She actually taught Daniel Chester French, and then he later went on to sculpt the Minuteman statue that's in the park that I showed you earlier, as well as the Lincoln Memorial. There's a couple others in there that are I found pretty interesting. Mark Daniels, the director of I Love Lucy and Star Trek, the original series. He's buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, as well as Mary Lemist Titcomb. She's the founder of the Bookmobile. So I thought that was kind of a nice, fun library connection. She's buried there too. So that's kind of just a real nice overview, I think, of my trip, of all of the places in Concord, Massachusetts that are connected with Louisa May Alcott. I am happy to take questions if you have any. But first, I just wanted to also give you some information if you are interested in learning more about Louisa May Alcott. There's information there about the podcast that I mentioned earlier. It's called Let Genius Burn, and we have 2 seasons out where we talk about her, her life and her legacy. And we also interview the director of Orchard House Museum, some of her biographers who've written books about her, as well as other artists and people who have done lots of different projects about Louisa, who have been influenced by Louisa. So you can find that pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts or on our website at letgeniusburn.com.